Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Well-Rounded Saxophonist, a podcast that aims to provide valuable information to young saxophonists and music students in a digestible amount of time. I'm Owen Robinson, and today I will be interviewing Australian saxophonist Joshua Hyde, professor of saxophone and chamber music at the Geneva University of Music in Geneva, Switzerland. Josh, it's great to have you on the show today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So my first question is, what are some of your musical specialties as a performer?
It's a good question. That's a good question. I guess what I'm most well known for and what I predominantly tour the world doing is kind of new music. So I've been doing a lot of all kinds of different new music with a bunch of different groups for the past while, let's say. So I guess that would be my speciality is really kind of the collaborative process with composers, and trying to get the best out of them, or trying to get the best out of a score, whether that's in a solo setting with electronics or in different groups. I perform with a bunch of different groups in various different contexts. I founded a new music ensemble in Paris in 2011, I think, called Sound Initiative, and we started out just doing kind of chamber music, new music, and it gradually evolved to, we did a lot of stuff with technology, and then it kind of evolved again, and we were doing a lot of kind of physical, interdisciplinary kind of stuff where we would be working with choreographers and creating works that were kind of on the threshold between music and kind of almost physical theater, but kind of incorporating multiple kind of art forms in one. I play with a group called Music Fabrik in Germany when they need a saxophone player, and that's kind of more, I guess you could say, more traditional new music. So it's like a larger ensemble, often with a conductor. I have a duo with a percussionist in Montreal called Scapegoat, and we call ourselves like a hybrid duo or a meta duo, which means that we kind of extend our instruments through the use of kind of electronics, and that can be, using a computer, or it can also be a lot of the time using kind of different kinds of amplification or guitar pedals or performer-controlled electronics. So we've done a lot of work with the composers like Mauricio Pali or Santiago Diaz-Fisher or Michel Lou, Sabrina Schroeder, people like that are working with this kind of hybrid kind of electronics, performer-controlled electronics. I also perform with a group called Elision in Australia, and it's a group that's kind of made it's I guess on the international new music scene, it's kind of considered as one of the more hardcore groups of new music in the world, because they kind of, the modus operandi is kind of taking the hardest scores they can find, whether it's kind of Brian Ferneyhough, Michael Finnessy, or Aaron Cassidy or Tim McCormack, or composers like that, and just playing these scores that are basically unplayable. So what I like in you can say new music is my specialty, but within new music there are so many different facets of what's going on. So I guess being in all those different ones is kind of, for me, there's so much difference in them all. And I also write music and kind of improvise in this kind of style as well. So I guess that's my specialty, and I'm very fortunate that I get to travel the world and do that pretty constantly, which is really amazing.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's, I think pretty niche to be able to specialize in new music. I know, a lot of us saxophonists find ourselves, kind of playing the classics and playing in jazz ensembles, etc. But it is, a very niche thing to be able to specialize in new music.
I think the reality is that if you don't specialize, you don't get to play. I think whatever, it doesn't have to be new music, but I feel like a lot of us kind of, and I see this with my students as well, you kind of think that you need to be able to do everything that everyone's doing before you give yourself permission to kind of find your own voice or find your own path. you look at the competition circuit and you think, oh, if I'm not winning competitions, I'm not allowed to, do my own thing. And I think that's false. I think that's a really dangerous idea, because you have to start doing your own thing as early as possible to find your niche. And I think you can't really expect to be called for a gig unless you have a real niche, unless you have a real speciality. I know for myself, like, I try and think of the things that I do best, and I try and kind of focus on those, so that when someone needs a performance of a particular piece, or when a composer needs a saxophone player, they know that they can call me and I'll do that, because that's kind of my thing. And you can think about that in all kinds of different music, whether it's jazz, whether it's particular kinds of improvisation, whether it's kind of, I don't know, playing Baroque music, or particular kinds of transcriptions. I often think about, the saxophone. What musics need the saxophone? What kind of music needs the saxophone? And outside of jazz and improvised music, and I guess popular music, there aren't so many spaces where we're really needed. So it's kind of, the battle for me is really finding music, or creating music, or collaborating with people on music that really needs the saxophone to be there. So if we weren't there, then people would be looking for us, which is not always the case. People aren't always looking for someone to play the Creston Sonata.
Right. Yeah, I think it was Jan Barry Baker has a presentation on no one will pay you to play the Crescent Sonata. I think that's yeah, and I think that's an amazing point. I was happy that you brought up the competition circuit, and I think especially I've noticed here in America with classical saxophone, a lot of people do get very obsessed with the competition circuit, and I think a lot of them do define their artistry by which pieces are popular, which pieces are required, and they dedicate so much time to that I think I've seen a lot of saxophonists who don't necessarily have a specialty or a niche or something that they're extremely interested in just by their own accord. So I was happy you brought that up because I think it is very important to look inside yourself as an artist and also realize what you do well, even if that's not necessarily what's going on in the competition world.
For sure. And I don't think it's just in North America that people are over obsessed with these competitions. I mean, it's huge in Europe as well, but I think it's becoming a real problem, because we kind of, it's too easy. It's too easy to play for other saxophone players. It's too easy to kind of define the playing field in such a narrow way, and then propose that as kind of an artistic endeavor. For me, being an artist is bringing something new into the world. That's really what being an artist is for me, anyway. And whether that's a new way of playing, a new way of programming, a new way of kind of just new music in itself. By definition, for me, just repeating the same stuff that everyone else is playing is not artistic really in any way. And the longer you do it, it kind of delays that kind of moment where you really look into yourself and kind of choose something. And that kind of muscle, we don't really train that muscle, that the kind of choosing muscle, because the only real creative choice you have as an interpreter of written down music is the choice of the pieces that you play. It's the only creative choice you have. Once you choose a piece, there are some minor interpretation things that you can do, but everything is really dependent on the style, dependent on what the composer wanted, dependent on performance practice. So the only real creative choice you have is the piece that you play, which are the pieces that you choose to play, the pieces that you choose to program together, and you could say also the places where you play them, the context. But when you're doing competitions and you're even if you're choosing from a list, the list is defined. You maybe have 5 pieces to choose from per category. That's not being an artist. That's not flexing that muscle of that creative muscle. And I find, and the longer that we leave that moment of starting to flex that muscle, the harder it becomes, and the shallower really so-called artists are becoming, because it can be until you're in your 30s that you stop doing competitions and you actually start to think about, what does it mean to be an artist, a performer? What does it mean to choose repertoire that's pertinent to society, pertinent to the people that I'm playing it for. And so I think competitions are a real problem.
Yeah.
They're great. They're great for learning the saxophone, and they're a great motivational tool for some students to learn, just kind of practice. And I've done competitions, obviously, but I think it's all about balance.
Yeah, no, I've done competitions as well, and it's it can be fun. It's a great motivator and a deadline for uh, musical growth, but also it's not the end all be all, um, and it can really get in the way of one's individuality and artistry. I You also play jazz saxophone, which I want to talk about in a little bit. Which said, I'm way into jazz. I'm actually doing a dual masters in classical and jazz saxophone at Florida State
Fantastic.
this yeah. And Anyway, so we'll talk about that soon. But I have another question. And I want to preface this question by pointing out that nobody's perfect, but what are you looking for, shall we say, in the ideal saxophone student?
You mean when they're trying to audition for my studio?
Yes, yeah, pretty much.
I try and choose students that are intelligent, that listen, that are engaged. Um, the saxophone's not very hard to learn. The saxophone's not a particularly difficult instrument to learn. What is hard to learn is to be an artist, to be open, to be intelligent, to know how to listen, to be engaged. Being engaged is really important. Being able to talk about what motivates you, what inspires you, and what you're passionate about. That's what I'm looking for in a saxophone player. I'm looking for a musician, basically. Uh, any musician can learn the saxophone. Very few saxophone players can learn to be artists. So when I'm looking for students, if you're doing an audition and you're playing amazingly a couple pieces, and then in the interview you don't know what's going on, then it's probably not going to work out. So for me, the most important thing is really what's going on up here, because that's the hardest thing to kind of switch on.
That's a great answer. My professor throughout undergrad, I studied with Joe Luloff, and I think he would very much agree with you in that, it's not just about the technique, the notes on the page. It's about what you're saying artistically, how much you've thought about the music, and the kind of emotion and you put into the music and your engagement. He's one of the most engaged performers I've ever seen emotionally, and it really does, I think, upset him when he hears good performances with no thought behind them.
And I guess the other thing to understand is that my role in one of my roles in Geneva at the university is to teach the saxophone. So if you're expecting students to come in and playing amazingly, then it doesn't make any sense. Like I don't have anything to offer them if they already play amazingly. So if you only accept students that can already play the saxophone, it means that you don't think that you can teach anybody anything.
Yeah, now I wanted to get into the jazz saxophone questions. Who are some of your favorite jazz saxophonists and why?
Well, I mean, I guess it's going to be similar answers to a lot of people. Cannonball Adderley, John Coltrane. Um, I have to admit that I spent a lot of time listening to David Sanborn when I was growing up, um, and David just passed away recently, and I've been rewatching Night Music. I don't know if you know that TV show from the 80s.
I don't.
Um,
I'll have to check it out.
Check it out. Night Music was around 2 seasons, I think, in like I don't know the exact years, in the 80s, um, and it was hosted by David Sanborn, and Marcus Miller was the musical director. Um, and basically, they had like the total freedom to invite anybody they wanted, and they invited really people. It wasn't like today where on the TV you only see like these kind of superficial kind of bullshit musicians, that just everything's kind of perfect, but nothing is of any real interest. Um, Not everyone on the TV, obviously, but a lot of the time you see this is kind of really polished musicianship that's really created for TV. But they really invited, whoever they wanted. So you have people that are really from each kind of genre and a kind of a vast array of music making with some really amazing musicians, really, but musicians that you wouldn't necessarily know about unless you were in a real niche. They would have like people from the gospel world, from like the New Orleans kind of world, from like really the blues and all kind of musical genres, and they would invite them all, and they would kind of all play together. And David Sanborn would play with these bands, and I mean I really think he's a fantastic musician, and something that really inspires me and always has about the saxophone is the sound. David Sanborn has this amazing sound; you can recognize him instantly, and that's always something that for me is really important. So I guess the kind of typical kind of people, Kenny Garrett. I listen to a bunch. I used to love listening to Kenny Garrett, and I mean I still do. But yeah, somehow David Sanborn marked me with this real importance of tone and sound, and in his solo records, the way that he produces, with layering of octaves and things like that to really create this really amazing sound is something that's really marked me. I don't play with that sound. Obviously, no one can play with that sound, but the importance of sound and the importance of sound as an expressive tool, whether it's in jazz or classical music, is something that I think must come from that. Just like because the power of his sound was always so important to me.
Yeah, no, David Sanborn, I feel like whenever, people talk about him, that's kind of the first thing that comes to mind is how unique his sound is. And, I've tried even to transcribe, some of his solos, and it's so unique, it's like you can try to emulate it, but I'm a hard rubber mouthpiece guy. I don't love metal mouthpieces. But that aside, I felt like I couldn't get very close, to his sound.
Mm,
It's just there's something almost like intangible about it, so unique and different than
mm.
even other pop players. And Kenny Garrett, yeah, Kenny Garrett's amazing. And he's still playing, he's still doing all sorts of stuff.
Oh yeah.
And
Mm.
yeah, it's interesting, to listen back to some of his older records and how much I think his sound and style has permeated the jazz saxophone world.
Oh yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean,
Whenever I
I was always a huge fan of. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, no,
But
no.
I was always a huge fan of Miles Davis. Miles Davis was kind of my hero growing up, and so I didn't really follow saxophone players. I just listened. I had a friend that I used to play in jazz band with, our city jazz orchestra, and he had pretty much every Miles record that existed. So I'd go to his house and copy these CDs or buy them myself. And so any saxophone player that played with Miles, I would listen. And the recordings of Live in Montreux, um, from like was it like the late '80s with Kenny Garrett playing solos. Those recordings are just like wild. Like the solos that Kenny Garrett's pulling out is amazing. Just like the intensity, the energy. That for me is like that was where jazz was kind of headed. That was awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and now I'm also wondering, how do you find that playing jazz influences your overall musicianship and your teaching?
Well, I mean, I've had kind of a weird, musical life. I've been playing music now for over 30 years. I've been playing music professionally for, I'm going to think how old I am, for over like almost 25 years. Um, my first job when I was 15 was playing piano in restaurants and bars. I used to play, I started out with a residency every Friday, Saturday night in like the fanciest hotel in my town. And like I didn't know anything when I was 15. I'd been taking jazz piano lessons from the one of the teachers at my school, and I just kind of learned how to do it. As you have so many hours to practice in situation, so improvising and reading changes and all those kind of things just kind of became second nature to me. And I think that experience of just being in the performance situation for so many hours, by the time I left Australia, I'd been doing it for maybe 5 years. every Friday and Saturday night, and it's like over 1,000 hours of just performance time in that alone, let alone all the other stuff that I was doing. Um, and so that I think really has been super important to me as a musician, just that experience of performing over and over again, and 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 improvising as well, kind of listening to the audience, listening to what people are listening for. It's after you do that for such a long time, you can really hear the way people are listening, and you really adapt to that as you're playing. And so I did that for a long time, and I learned saxophone from when I was like 12 or something, when I started in high school. And I really wanted to be a jazz musician. That was all I wanted to do. And I ended up getting into classical saxophone. Really loved the course that I was studying at my undergrad in Melbourne, and ended up kind of going down that path. Um, all the while, kind of, playing some saxophone, playing some jazz saxophone, and playing some jazz piano, but not a lot. When I moved to France, I kind of went into 10 years of classical saxophone mode, did all the classical saxophone things. And then after I'd kind of got the stamp from the Paris Conservatory and got the stamp of winning some of these international competitions, then I was allowed to kind of do whatever I wanted again. So I was like, now I'm going to go back and so I've been really trying to delve into it in a really personal kind of way. I mean, I'm not someone that's really interested in kind of playing straight ahead, kind of bebop or anything. I think it's interesting to know how all that works, but it's not really my personal language. So for my teaching, I think it's super important, because I don't think you can be a saxophone player without knowing how to play some jazz. Whether it's jazz or whether it's blues or whether it's just being able to play in a big band, whatever it is, I think you need to have some experience with that musical language. I think our instrument is so linked to that you can't really deny that. I think you're doing yourself a disservice, and you're always in some way going to be a bit frustrated, which seems so obvious, I guess, when you come from an Anglo English speaking perspective. But when you're in Europe, it's not necessarily as obvious. There are a lot of students that don't play any jazz, have never played anything. So I really integrated into my pedagogy in Geneva, and I'm probably one of the only people that does that systematically in continental Europe nowadays, because it's really just not done. Europe kind of has this idea that you can only do one thing well. So you either play classical music or you play jazz, and if you kind of do both, you're not going to be good at either of them. I think that's bullshit. I think that the more flexibility you have, the more tonal color palettes you have with the instrument, the more interesting your sound is going to be. So I have a kind of seminar that I run with my students about, making a sound, talking about different mouthpieces, different reed setups, how to approach them. For me, it's a totally different instrument when you approach it as a jazz instrument. The way you kind of blowing into it, the way your tongue's positioned, the voicing, the way the embouchure is, the articulation, all of it's totally different. But there is some crossover, I think, and there are some pedagogical things, particularly in articulation. I think there's some things about using air and using articulation that are really helpful when learning classical saxophone. But no, for me, it's a really fundamental part of my personal practice. And I've been really happy to get back into it in these last 5 or 6 years.
That's a great answer. I always find it fascinating, when saxophonists cross over, and it influences almost both disciplines in a way. For me, I've talked to a lot of jazz musicians about this, and I think, I've kind of come to more or less a conclusion that it's all music. It's kind of different ways of expressing, in many ways, the same things, the same notes, the same, different styles, different ideas. But I think of all of it as music. I actually am more of a bebop, straight ahead kind of player. I think it's just because I went to Michigan State for 4 years, and that's what the folks in the jazz studies program here do. It's a lot of swing, a lot of bebop. But I do find myself often I gravitate more towards like the post bop kind of players. I mean, I'm a huge Coltrane fan, and then kind of everybody who kind of exploded out of that Coltrane influence, like Michael Brecker, Chris Potter. I'm big fans of, the flashy tenor players. But I actually find that, I prefer to emulate some of the more like bebop and hard bop tenor players, Dexter Gordon, Hank Mobley, Jimmy Heath. I'm a big fan of those kind of players. Although, listening, I think still Coltrane and Brecker and them, those are some of
Mm.
my favorites. So also, I'm curious about your quartet. So I was reading a little bit about, so you're in the Australian Saxophone Quartet. And I read that part of your mission statement is creating, reviving, and promoting Australian music at home and abroad. So I was curious what kinds of Australian music you're playing. Is this like traditional Australian music, Australian classical music, new
Um,
music?
well, it's a relatively new project. We kind of started last year, and it's been primarily new music. So when we say reviving, I guess it's more pieces that have been written in the last 10 years or so, have maybe been played once and then kind of left by the wayside. And so we recorded a CD last year that'll be coming out hopefully this year, where we recorded Lisa Lim's quartet called Ash, which is a large scale work that she wrote for a Spanish quartet, which is a really intense kind of piece. We recorded a piece by Mary Finster for two percussionists and saxophone quartet that was written maybe 10 or 15 years ago and got premiered but never got recorded. And it's a really interesting piece. Her musical language has kind of gone from the kind of avant-garde, now is kind of more inspired by Renaissance music, with some kind of a contemporary take on that kind of language. We also recorded a piece called Echo Chamber, which is the I guess call it the title track of the disc. And we recorded, what else did we record? I forget, but there's a few different Australian composers who are all living. A piece by Ken Hope, for four saxophones and four bass amps and electronics. So yeah, it's kind of new music, new Australian music, contemporary music, that had been written, had kind of not been put out there, I guess. And so we're kind of trying to give it a bit of a stage.
Nice. Nice. That's really cool. How do you balance encouragement and criticism while helping a student reach their full potential as an artist?
I think it's really important to kind of um, make it clear to students that learning is a team kind of thing. It's not kind of the student coming to the teacher and then kind of being beaten down and say, this is terrible, go away, do it again. For me, it's really a team activity, where the student and the teacher are the team, and you have to work together to overcome obstacles, to whether that's can be anything. It can be lack of motivation, lack of technical capacity, lack of understanding, lack of listening, whatever it is. But as long as the student understands what's going on, I think you cannot lose if they're willing to put the work in. As long as the teacher can outline and make it clear what's going on, what needs to happen for the student to be where they need to be. And I think it's kind of looking at it with a more organic approach, in that, for example, I don't make my students play pieces that they don't want to play. I don't force them. I don't choose their repertoire most of the time. I really make sure that they're listening to as much music as they can, and that they get inspired, and they find music that they really enjoy, and that they play that. And that's most of the hurdles overcome. When they have an intrinsic motivation to learn something because they like the music, then they're really, they have this need for guidance and for help, whether it's about the instrument, whether it's about musical understanding. And that's where the role of the teacher comes in, and it's not really about criticizing them; it's about guiding them. So I don't think I don't think it's either. I don't think it's either or. And a lot of the time, I don't think criticism, really has a place. It's not really criticism. It's kind of guidance and saying, okay, making sure the student wants to be somewhere. Because if the student doesn't want to be anywhere, if they're just there and I'm great, uh, you know, give me a stamp, give me a diploma. That's not the kind of studio that I run. I expect my students to want to go somewhere, to want to learn something, to want to expand their horizons, and I'm there to help guide them towards that and give them the tools to do that. So somehow it's not about me criticizing them; it's about showing them the way, and that often is just kind of opening their ears so that they can hear what should be done, by listening to a bunch of good recordings, and then me helping them to get to that place.
I like that answer. That's a good one. Yeah, it's interesting to think about. I've had, I think, similar answers where it's almost like I use the word criticism, but I like that you said guidance instead. And making sure the student wants to be somewhere. I think criticism has this connotation of like the student is not at a certain benchmark, and this is how you get there, or this is not good enough. And I think some teachers do think like that, but I very much agree with your approach of, it seems like you would agree that music is a never ending pursuit. It's like, like you said, a lot of people kind of fall into that, I want the stamp, I want the diploma, I want the piece of paper. Whereas, it's like beyond the educational portion of it, it's a lot more about what you're doing, and what you're playing, what you've invested into yourself on your own, than it is about where you studied, or what qualifications you have.
Hmm. And I think it's important too to understand that this kind of um, this external motivation, whether it's positive or negative, it can work. It can work in the short term, but really, if you want a student to be a lifelong learner and to really take pleasure in the process, is the thing that I often say is, if you love the process, you can go as far as you want. You will always achieve something. But if you love success, or if you love the accolades, then it's always going to fizzle out, because there's so few and far between the real successes, or the things that feel like success, because a lot of the time we are living success day to day, but we don't realize it because we're always looking for that next high. You get into the conservatory, oh, that's great, but that fizzles out, and then you want to win a competition, and that fizzles out, and then you want to get a job. There's always something else. But if you really love the process, if you really love practicing, if you really love listening to music, then you can't really go wrong. So really trying to find, trying to kind of give that to students, try and find a place where they're really excited about practicing and really excited about listening to music, then that's a lifelong kind of gift that you've given them. So trying to find that, not through external motivation, but really trying to find what switches them on, what they're really interested in, uh, and what their personal journey is, and try and put them on that as soon as possible. That's really my pedagogical philosophy, is to try to figure out what they come to me by definition, they're all saxophone players. I don't believe in the term classical saxophone, by the way. I think you play the saxophone. Classical saxophone is some kind of research project that we started in 1942 or whatever it was with Marcel Mule. That's not really been a musical thing come out of classical saxophone. I think we're saxophone players, and so the only thing that they really have in common is the fact that they blow in this golden tube. But I really try and find what their secondary thing is, and so I have students in my class that they will play the saxophone. They'll learn all the different saxophones in all different kinds of musical genres. But some will be more interested in jazz. So I have one student at the moment who's more interested in kind of Middle Eastern improvisation. So she also studies at the same time with a really amazing improviser who I think he's Egyptian. I'm not sure where he's from, Basil Rajoub, he's a fantastic musician. So she will improvise with these maqams and writes her own music as well. I have some that have been really interested in composition, or some that have been interested in contemporary music, some in improvisation, others really invested in pedagogy, some in conducting. And I really try and push them down these paths as early as possible, so that they create a really personal artistic practice right from the beginning, and so they don't find themselves at 30 years old having tried to win competitions, and then they look around and see that their colleagues have got groups, they've got a group that they play with, they've got musical projects, but I see a lot of students that get to kind of the end of the competition circuit and don't play with anyone. They don't play music. They don't like listening to music. They don't like practicing, and they don't like working with other people. It's just the accolades that they're after, and I do not want that for my students.
That's great. So now I have just some general questions. What do you like to do outside of music?
It's a good question. That's a good question. I like to travel. I like to read. I like learning languages. Um, I've been running a lot. I'm not very good at running, but I try and do I try and do it almost every day. But I feel like it's the kind of thing that if you don't do it for a week or so, then you go back to square one. So I'm not particularly good at that, but I do enjoy it. I do like cycling as well. Yeah, I guess for me, I'm all about discovering. I like maybe that's why I do lots of new music in my career. But I like discovering new things. Um, and I feel like the musical realm is so vast that there's you need about 6 lifetimes to even scratch the surface. So in my musical, between performing and composing and teaching and improvising and collaborating and playing in bands and all these things, and then going to listen to concerts. I mean, it's always been my favorite thing to do, is listen to music. So I love, I live in Paris, and you can go out and hear, you know, there's a little website that has all the different groups that are playing, all the kind of weird experimental stuff that I like. And there can be like 12 concerts a night, 20 concerts a night of just whatever. Um, so, once you get past all that musical stuff, there's not a lot of time for anything else.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. I feel that too especially during the semester for me as a student. It's like this, you get kind of swept up. It's like a tornado goes through your life, and you're
Mm.
finally done with the semester. You're like, you know,
What do I do?
you yeah, what do I do? Yeah, yeah. One more question. Outside of classical music, what kind of music do you like to listen to? I feel like we've covered some of it, but
Outside of classical music, um, I mean, classical music's already so vast, isn't it? For when you count music from Renaissance all through everything to music of nowadays, that's a lot of music already. But I love, I spend most of my youth listening to either jazz or like alternative rock or whatever was on the radio. Um, Back in the days when you'd listen to the radio. I really love kind of ambient music. Um, People like Tim Heck, Ben Frost, um, Lawrence English, that kind of stuff, or like Christian Fennis, um, the kind of electronic ambient kind of vibe. Uh, that's one of my favorite things. In my compositional work, I really kind of verging on the kind of minimal, and sometimes when I incorporate electronics into what I write, a lot of it's inspired by that kind of work. And I work a lot with a guy called Anthony Tan, who's Canadian, and he's also inspired by that kind of music, and we collaborate together on some things. And it's this kind of ambient infused electronica. I like it. What else do I listen to? Oh, I mean, all kinds of things. Yeah, I listen to everything. I just love music. For me, it's like if there's music on, I really can't concentrate on anything else. There are very few genres that I don't enjoy listening to. I listen to some hip hop, but not so much. But yeah, I'll listen to pretty much anything. I'm not sure I could even think of a genre that I don't particularly like. I tend not to like the things that are overplayed, like Queen or like Kamina Burana or like stuff like that. Some
Right.
some things some things that just get played and played and played because people have no imagination. Um, I don't like those things, but
Right,
that's not the
yeah.
music's fault.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's like, how many times have we heard Karl Orff, right? Carmina Burana. Like, I mean,
Yeah,
it's brilliant music, and I mean, my parents got to hear it live this past year with the Lansing Symphony, which I'm sure is an incredibly different experience. But it's like, it's almost become some things almost become comedic the amount of times you hear them. I myself am always trying to find things that aren't in the mainstream. Something really like new, something really exciting.
what have you found recently? What have been the things that you've found?
I've been on honestly, for the past year, a huge bluegrass kick. I love. There's this great group, the Punch Brothers.
Hmm.
Chris Thiele is the lead, singer mandolinist, and he's done a lot of work with like Yo-Yo Ma, Edgar Meyer. He plays a lot of Bach. He's an incredible musician, improviser. But this group, it's kind of like a newer wave bluegrass ensemble. And they take, more classic bluegrass songs and kind of rework them in very dynamic and artistic ways. And then, that kind of got me into Tony Rice, some more traditional bluegrass, flat picking guitar. Um, so I've been listening to a lot of that. Always a lot of jazz. Been listening to like Art Farmer, Jimmy Heath, Hank Mobley lately. Um, and I'm trying to think. Oh yeah, I just discovered Hiromi, uh, pianist Hiromi has a great album called The Silver Lining Suite. I think it was released in 2021, and it's her on piano with string quartet, and it's
Yes.
quite amazing. It kind of flip flops between very classical sounding writing and then jazz improvisation. It's very interesting. Like the cellist will be playing the bass line, and then she's kind of doing like a right hand sort of thing, to that. It's great. It's I found it really interesting. So been listening to that this week or so. Thank you for listening. This concludes episode 15 of The Well-Rounded Saxophonist, featuring special guest Joshua Hyde, professor of saxophone and chamber music at the Geneva University of Music in Geneva, Switzerland. The music you heard in this episode was composed by Dorothy Chang, performed by Zachary Costello, alto saxophone, and Guillaume Ra, piano. Thank you for listening, and remember to practice smart and stay healthy.